Next up, we're diving into the wild world of trade wars and tariffs, folks, and I'm calling this episode Tariff Takedown: How the US Trade War is Reshaping the Global Economy. I mean, can you believe it? The US has just imposed fresh tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and China's already firing back with its own set of duties. It's like a game of economic ping pong, and we're about to explore the potential consequences of this escalating trade war.
Wow, that's crazy. So, what's the big deal about these tariffs? I mean, aren't they just a way for countries to, protect their own interests?
Well, yes and no. Tariffs can be a tool for protecting domestic industries, but they can also have some serious unintended consequences. For example, when the US imposes tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada might retaliate with its own tariffs on US exports. It's like a never-ending cycle of tit for tat, and it can get pretty messy.
Hmm, okay. So, what kind of consequences are we talking about? Like, how does this affect regular people?
Great question. Well, for one thing, tariffs can drive up the cost of goods for consumers. Imagine you're a farmer in Iowa, and you rely on exporting your soybeans to China. If China slaps a tariff on US soybeans, that means you're going to get paid less for your crops. And then, if you're a consumer who buys soy-based products, you might see the price of those products go up.
Right. Got it. So, it's like a ripple effect? The tariffs affect one industry, and then that has a knock-on effect on other industries and consumers?
Exactly. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples can spread far and wide, and in this case, the consequences could be pretty significant. I mean, we're talking about a potential trade war between some of the world's largest economies.
Whoa, that sounds serious. So, what's the likelihood that this thing escalates into a full-blown trade war? I mean, can't they just, talk it out or something?
Laughs well. I wish it were that simple. The thing is, trade wars are often driven by politics and nationalism rather than just economic interests. And once you've got a cycle of retaliation going, it can be hard to stop.
Hmm, okay. So, what about companies like Target and Best Buy? How are they affected by all this?
Ah, great example. Those companies are already feeling the pinch from tariffs. I mean, if they're importing goods from China or Canada, they've got to pay more for those goods due to the tariffs. And then they've got to decide whether to pass those costs on to consumers or absorb them themselves.
Hmm, that's a tough spot to be in. So, do you think this trade war is going to have a big impact on the US economy as a whole?
Well, it's definitely possible. I mean, we're already seeing some of the effects. The stock market's been volatile and some industries are getting hit pretty hard. But the question is, how long will this trade war last? And what will be the ultimate cost to American businesses and consumers?
Right. So it's like a waiting game at this point. We just have to see how things play out.
Exactly. Although I've got to say, some of the experts I've talked to are warning about the potential for a pretty significant downturn if this trade war escalates further. It's like imagine a big storm cloud gathering on the horizon. You can't quite predict when it'll hit, but you know it's coming.
Pauses. Hmm. Okay. I think I'm starting to get it. So, what's the worst case scenario here? Like, what if this trade war just keeps escalating and escalating?
Pauses dramatically. Well, that's a great question, and one that we'll be exploring in more depth as we go along. But let's just say it's not pretty. I mean, we're talking about the potential for widespread job losses, higher prices for consumers, and even a possible recession.
Excitedly. Whoa, that sounds like a real economic apocalypse. Okay. So, what can be done to prevent that from happening?
Ah, now that's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we'll be debating throughout this episode. But for now, let's just say that it's going to take some serious diplomacy and negotiation to get us out of this trade war mess. Next up, we're diving into the world of trade wars and tariffs, and I'm calling this episode Tariff Takedown: How Corporate America is Coping. We're going to explore how companies like Target and Best Buy are navigating the complex landscape of tariffs and their impact on corporate profits. Joining me is a special guest who's new to the topic, but eager to learn. So let's get started. The recent earnings reports from Target and Best Buy show that the effects of tariffs are already being felt, but the question remains, are these companies doing enough to mitigate the effects, or are they simply passing the costs on to consumers?
Hmm, that's a great question. I mean, I've heard of tariffs, but I'm not really sure how they work. Can you explain it in simple terms? Like, what's the point of tariffs, anyway?
Ah, absolutely. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods, and they're used to protect domestic industries and raise revenue for the government. But in this case, the tariffs imposed by Trump are more like a trade war tactic, aimed at negotiating better deals with other countries. Now, when it comes to companies like Target and Best Buy, they're feeling the pinch because they rely heavily on imported goods.
Right? So it's like if I'm buying a TV from Best Buy and it's made in China, then Best Buy has to pay a tariff on that TV, which increases their costs. But, um, how do they mitigate those costs? Do they just raise prices or what?
Exactly. You're on the right track. Companies can try to absorb the costs themselves, but often they pass them on to consumers through price hikes. However, that's not always a viable strategy, especially in competitive markets like retail. Some companies might try to diversify their supply chains, finding alternative sources for their products, or renegotiate with their suppliers to reduce costs.
I see. So it's like a big game of risk management. But what about Target's warning that tariffs will put pressure on their first quarter profit? Are they just being cautious? Or is there something more going on?
Well, when Target says that, it's likely because they're expecting the tariffs to eat into their profit margins. They might be anticipating a decrease in sales if they have to raise prices, or they could be facing increased costs from their suppliers. It's a complex situation, and companies like Target are trying to navigate it by, for example, investing in domestic manufacturing or exploring new markets.
Um, that makes sense. But what about Best Buy's muted annual sales forecast? Is that related to the tariffs as well?
Yes, it is. Best Buy's forecast suggests that they're being cautious about consumer spending, which could be affected by the tariffs. If consumers are facing higher prices due to tariffs, they might cut back on discretionary spending like buying new electronics. It's a ripple effect, really.
Wow! I had no idea it was so complicated. But what about other companies? Are they all just passing the costs on to consumers? Or are some of them finding creative ways to mitigate the effects?
Ah, that's a great question. Some companies are indeed finding innovative ways to cope with the tariffs. For example, some are investing in automation to reduce labor costs, while others are exploring new markets or diversifying their product lines.
Hmm, that's really interesting. And, what about the impact on smaller businesses? Are they more vulnerable to the effects of tariffs?
Yes, smaller businesses can be disproportionately affected by tariffs because they often have less resources to absorb the costs. They might not have the same negotiating power as larger companies, and they could struggle to adapt to the changing trade landscape.
Right? I can see how that would be a problem. It's like the big companies can weather the storm, but the smaller ones might get wiped out. What's the outlook for the future then? Are we going to see more tariffs? Or is there a way to resolve these trade disputes?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. The outlook is uncertain, and it really depends on how the trade negotiations play out. But one thing is clear: companies need to be proactive in managing their risks and finding ways to mitigate the effects of tariffs. It's a challenging time for corporate America, but also an opportunity for innovation and growth.